Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us today for our webinar on Closing the Implementation Gap, how policy and practice work together to improve reading outcomes. Today, I will be joined by my co-host, Casey Sullivan-Taylor, who is our Policy Director for Early Literacy. You may use the chat box to introduce yourself and to also comment. But you can also use the Q&A box to ask questions. The questions will be monitored by Sonia Yates. And if possible, at the end of this presentation, we will have an opportunity to answer some of those questions. So let's begin. At Excel in Ed, we believe that policy changes lives. In our comprehensive literacy policy, we address learning differences by highlighting the importance of equipping teachers with knowledge and best practices needed to provide instruction that is responsive to students' needs. In addition, we communicate how the roles of stakeholders, including families, educators, community members, and policymakers, impact student success. Lastly, we promote effective Tier 1 instruction as a preventative measure while ensuring that we are understanding that early literacy identification of reading deficiencies and targeted interventions can help students overcome potential reading challenges later in life. So what is this comprehensive approach to improving reading outcomes that we talk about a lot here at Excel in Ed? Our comprehensive approach includes preventative measures and also includes interventions to support students as we identify students early who may be at risk for reading failure. But then we also provide these supports that are included in these 4 domains as we support our students to improve their reading outcomes. So the first domain is supports for teachers and policy. In this area, we believe that science of reading training that builds teacher knowledge, literacy and reading coaches who support teachers in transferring theory to practice, and then also our educator preparation programs with its alignment to the science of reading in their coursework, and also an alignment of the assessment that is used for candidates to receive initial licensure are extremely important. Now, you may see that there's 17, and then it's marked through, so strike through, and then there's 18. We thought it best that these 2 particular principles were standalone principles, as we know that each has its own significant impact on how well our educator preparation program, their candidates, are prepared to teach reading on day 1. And then lastly, in this domain, funding for literacy efforts. It is extremely important to ensure that all components of the implementation of a literacy law are funded. The next domain is assessment and parent notification. Identification is critical in ensuring that students receive the supports that they need. So screening students 3 times per year with universal screeners, identifying students through screeners that identify characteristics of dyslexia for all students, not just for students who are flagged initially by a screener, but for all students, especially in kindergarten, 1st, and 2nd grade, is important in the early identification process. And then also notification for parents of students that may have reading difficulties. We want to make sure that our parents are notified and are a part of the process on the front end and not receive information after the middle of the year or the end of the year. The next domain is instruction and intervention. And I apologize today. I'm suffering from a sinus infection, so I apologize. For instruction and intervention, these different principles all come together to ensure that our teachers are equipped with the tools that they need to support students, high quality instructional materials, but also making sure that those materials do not have any presence of 3Qing instructional strategies, right? Those strategies that have been proven harmful, over the long term for teaching students how to read. But also ensuring that students who are identified receive the interventions and supports that they need, whether they're before, during, or after school. And then for those students, documenting those interventions in individual reading plans, providing summer learning opportunities for students, and then also providing resources to parents so that they can support reading at home. Last but not least, which in some states and in some cases is the elephant in the room, the retention component. But retention utilized as an intervention opportunity for students who may not have become skilled readers by the end of third grade. So opportunities for retention as an intensive intervention in third grade, good cause exemptions for those students, and also multiple opportunities for promotion. From policy to practice, key features of our Early Literacy Matters 2.0 website and this new resource web tool that we are so excited about. It's live now. You can go to earlyliteracymatters.org, but I am going to take some time to just kind of walk you through these key features of the updates to our Early Literacy Matters site. Early Literacy Matters 2.0, as we call it, is a focus on not just policy, as it has been in the past, or policy adoption, but it's also a focus on practice, implementation. How well are we able to transfer this policy adoption into practice on the ground? So the key features that have remained, we have our homepage that gives key statistics about early literacy in our country. It also discusses each of the fundamental principles. And then once you click on the tab for comprehensive early literacy policy, then it speaks to some of the common challenges that we may see with implementation across the country, and then also some of the ways in which states are addressing these challenges. It also details each of the fundamental principles by giving descriptions of those principles as well, and links to resources as well. The literacy map. My colleagues joke because this is the part of the tool that I really, really love. This has been such a work in progress over the last year for our team here at Excel in Ed, because we were getting questions around implementation. Some states are saying, well, we've adopted all of these fundamental principles, but we have not been able to see the gains, right, that have translated into improved student outcomes that possibly some other states that have adopted these principles have seen. So what are we not doing? With this literacy map, the user will be able to look at our key. We were able to develop a rubric by which we graded implementation efforts, the degree to which these fundamental principles that I spoke about earlier are being implemented within each of the fundamental principles. So this is the implementation key. And if you click on the implementation color key, there are brief descriptions here, just kind of general descriptions about full implementation, which means that the fundamental principle is adopted in policy and there is evidence that this policy is being fully implemented. Partial implementation, so full implementation will be green. Partial implementation, which is yellow. It says that the fundamental principle is adopted in policy. However, there may be limited information for the degree to which this principle is being implemented, or there may be a lot of evidence that is being implemented, but it still does not reach full implementation. And then future implementation, which is this principle has been adopted in policy with a future date For implementation, because there may be some states that say beginning in 2025, 26, we will implement this policy. And that's going to be in orange, and then policy not adopted, which will be in red, which speaks to the fact that the fundamental principle, or principle not adopted, that the fundamental principle has yet to be adopted in policy, rules, or regulations. The next part of this page is filter the map by principle. And I'm going to get into this particular feature a little later, but if you click on filter the map by principle, you will have a drop down of options that you can filter to get more information about implementation. And I'm excited to talk to you about that. And then looking for best practices. So if you click on this button will take you to state examples of how they have implemented each of those fundamental principles effectively. And then lastly, from this page, you will be able to download the 50-state scan, the 50-state analysis, of course, plus the District of Columbia. You will be able to look at a snapshot of a scan landscape across the country for the checklist of which principles have been adopted. There are also links to their adoption of policies and laws, and we will look more closely at that a little bit later. So the implementation analysis rubric, the big question is, what metrics did we use to grade implementation? So this is just a screen grab of the first domain that I spoke of earlier, which is the supports for teachers in policy. And for the purpose of this presentation, I will look at the science of reading training. I'm going to look at it with a state and its implementation. So when we think about the descriptors for science of reading training and how we graded implementation, for a state to receive full implementation of science of reading training, the state has adopted this science of reading training, and it is required for all K-3 teachers and administrators, and an implementation rollout plan is evident, and it's also communicated to all stakeholders. So there are several states that have adopted science of reading training. However, the training may not be required, which leads us to the partial implementation level. The state offers science of reading professional development, or they require districts to adopt a policy to identify science of reading training, providers of the training, and personnel who will participate. And participation may be optional. So for states that have received partial implementation, either the state has adopted one training for the state, maybe a single vendor. They have either adopted a list of training and then allowed school districts to identify the trainers or the professional development that they want to have their teachers attend. But with all of these things, training may be optional, and it is just not required for all of their K-3 teachers and administrators. Filter by principle. So again, if you click on the filter the map by principle area, this is the drop down that you will see. So these 4 domains that I spoke to earlier, these are also consistent throughout the website. The fundamental principles will be organized under these 4 domains. So there is supports for teachers in policy, assessment and parent notification, instruction and intervention, and also retention and intervention. This is my favorite part of Early Literacy Matters 2.0. We're able to look at the national landscape through a heat map. So, for example, if you click on supports for teachers and policy, and also drop down to science of reading training, because this is embedded underneath that domain, you will first have a quick overview. I know so many times we're trying to figure out how many states have adopted this or how many states have adopted that. Well, this gives you a very quick overview of how many states have adopted the policy. And then there's this heat map. And what this heat map allows you to do is to look across the country to see not only which states have or have not adopted science of reading training, because again, the principle not adopted is going to be in red, but it also allows you to look at the degrees to which this principle is being implemented in each state across the country. So we're going to then dig a little further and let's look at Mississippi. I know some of you are saying, oh my gosh, Mississippi has been known for its science of reading training. Why is Mississippi indicated as partial implementation on science of reading training? So let's dig in. A great feature about this is if you click on the state in the map, it's going to take you to a state solo page. So for every state in the District of Columbia, you will see a state solo page. And for each of these pages, you will first get a snapshot of the number of principles that have been adopted in policy. And the snapshot also embeds the degree to which the principles have been implemented. This next section is really kind of your first look at the individual principles with the icons next to each of them that gives you kind of a first look at the degree to which these principles have been implemented. But the next best thing will be the full report. So we see that science of reading training is yellow with partial implementation, and we'll dig into why that is. And then lastly, see how we graded implementation. So that's our full rubric. So anytime you want to look at the level or the degree to which the state scored on implementation, this full rubric actually shows each of those areas, descriptors of partial implementation and full implementation, the way in which I showed the first one on a previous slide around supports for teachers and policy. Each state is, if you click on the button for the view, the full report, implementation report, so each state receives a document and you can click on it and link to it, you can print it, you can download it and those things. But for each state, you will see a customized homepage with the state's name, and then also, again, the snapshot of the number of principles adopted and the degree of implementation for each of the principles. If you notice, out of 18 fundamental principles, Mississippi is fully implementing 10 of those principles with 7 partial implementation, and there's 1 principle that is not adopted, and that is the prohibiting 3Qing instructional materials in policy. The next part of this implementation report will be the evidence, like all of the things that you need to know about how a state is implementing each of the fundamental principles. So first, in the right-hand corner, you will see the domain from which the policy, the fundamental principle is a part. Next, you will see the implementation level. And for science of reading training, Mississippi has partial implementation. And then there's the description. There's the description that reflects the rubric that says the state offers science of reading training or requires district to adopt a policy to identify the training. But participation in science of reading training may be optional for teachers and/or administrators. In Mississippi, science of reading training is required for all of our literacy support schools that have literacy coaches. A majority of the schools in districts have sent their teachers to science of reading professional development. And as you know, Mississippi has 1 vendor, AIM Pathways. But in statute, this is not required for all K-3 teachers and administrators, although Mississippi has done a lot in the area of training teachers, even secondary teachers, and also faculty in the science of reading. This evidence and guidance section is a great resource for states. Not only does it reflect what this particular state, Mississippi, is doing and the evidence that we have been able to collect around how they are implementing science of reading training. For other states that are just beginning, these are resources that you can follow the hyperlinks to those particular resources, and they can give you suggestions for implementation so that states do not have to recreate the wheel. There are so many states doing some amazing things around implementation, and these resources are really your one-stop shop for templates that have already been created by states, communications that have gone out to different stakeholders, right? And then the ways in which they are implementing their law through their implementation guides. So there are so many great resources that are included in each of these states' implementation reports. And then lastly, you'll see considerations for strengthening policy. So our Excel and Ed team provides considerations for ways in which they can strengthen the policy in order to achieve full implementation. I want to also share this particular part of Mississippi's implementation report around universal screeners. As you can see, it still follows the same format. Universal screeners is included under the domain for assessment and parent notification. So you'll see that in the top right-hand corner. The full implementation for this particular principle also goes above and beyond. So there will be states, again, that you will see in some of their principles that they have adopted and implemented. You will see the above and beyond badge for the way in which they're implementing that particular principle. There's also evidence and guidance included here. And then one thing that you'll notice about the considerations for strengthening policy, when it meets full implementation, then there will be no considerations for strengthening policy. Something that's important to note is that when you see states that may have future implementation for some of the principles, you may see future implementation, but you'll also see a consideration for strengthening policy. And that just means that even when this policy is implemented in the future, it may not meet the criteria for full implementation. So there are opportunities for the state, even before it's implemented, to strengthen that particular plan for implementation for that principle. Now, if you are in a meeting and you're saying, I'm not at my desktop or my laptop and I'm going to have to pull this up on my phone, don't be alarmed. We have intentionally created access to this website through a mobile platform for smartphones. One of the major differences is that you won't see the map. However, you will see the states listed alphabetically, and you will be able to click on your state and find all of the information that I just mentioned that will be available on the desktop site. And so lastly, I'll speak to this resource. I spoke to you earlier about being able to download the 50-state scan. So this is just a screen grab of what this scan looks like. And as you can see, it gives you the checklist really across states around which principles have been adopted. It gives a little bit more information about funding for those literacy efforts. It lists the educator preparation program assessment for candidates for licensure. If there is a check mark with the test, it means that that test is adopted and it meets the criteria for being aligned to the science of reading. But if the test is just listed and there is no check mark, then that means it's going to say that it's not adopted in policy. This is the test that they're using, but this assessment is not aligned to the science of reading. And we were fortunate enough to partner with NCTQ to pull data from recent reports that they have released around educator preparation program effectiveness. And so now I will turn it over to Casey to talk about our findings.
Thank you, Kymyona. I'm excited to talk with you about some of the findings that you can discover on our site. We know that policy adoption is critical, but we know that it also requires effective implementation to achieve those improved outcomes that we're all seeking. And so Kymyona talked to you about the filter feature on the map. And some of the things that you can discover, you can see each of the fundamental principles as she showed you. So if we just take a look at, say, 4 of them, we can see kind of a national perspective of how we're doing around those fundamental principles. So the first one we want to look at is science of reading training. We know that it's critical to build teacher knowledge around the science of reading to see improved outcomes from classroom instruction that gives us the best and the most for students to be able to learn to read effectively. And so when we look across the nation, we can see that 34 states offer some type of professional learning that's grounded in the science of reading, but we also see that only 9 of them require that all K-3 elementary educators, that could be teachers and administrators, must participate in the science of reading aligned training. And so that still leaves millions of teachers' knowledge of literacy development and instruction up to chance, and dependent upon either their EPP program and how aligned it might have been, or their own efforts to build their knowledge. So then if we take a look at literacy coaches, we know how valuable literacy coaches are in helping teachers transfer their knowledge from training into the classroom, into practice. And when we look at the state or each state across the nation, we can see that 26 states have adopted policy to support teachers with literacy coaches who are trained in the science of reading. So this means that there's still half of the nation that has not yet had the benefit that this critical mechanism can provide to support classroom instruction and student outcomes. I do want to mention on this one, to achieve full implementation, a state must have a literacy coach placed in all elementary schools across their state. We do have a few states who are almost there, but at this time, there's not currently a state that has a literacy coach assigned to each elementary school to achieve that full implementation level. And next, I'd like to look at the elimination of 3Qing. You can see from this picture of the nation that 10 states have committed to eliminating 3Qing from their instructional materials. We also have 3 that have extended that elimination into their ed prep programs. And we measure that under a different principle. It falls under the EPP alignment principle, but we do think it's worth mentioning that a number of states are starting to look at how do they extend that elimination of 3Qing to prohibit it not only from instructional materials in the classroom, but also into the educator preparation program. And so we know that this harmful practice of 3Qing has been proven to undermine reading. It undermines the development, and it creates confusion for students when they're trying to learn those critical reading skills that are necessary as a foundation. So we are really happy to see states moving in that direction. And you can see in the picture, states that are green have already, they're in the implementation process. The states that are orange, this is for future implementation, but they have adopted the policy. And finally, let's look at retention as an intensive intervention. Research has shown us that retention as an intensive intervention can improve reading outcomes. And we're seeing more research emerge moving forward as to the effectiveness of these comprehensive early literacy policies. And when we look at the national perspective, 18 states have required students to be retained for intensive intervention if they're unable to demonstrate sufficient reading skills to promote to 3rd grade. And that's based initially on the test-based options. We do also have another principle in which we look at multiple pathways, but for this particular principle, it is examining the test-based option as an initial retention piece. And we know that many students across the nation may still be socially promoted without sufficient reading skills. They may be moving on to 4th grade and beyond in the states who have not put in place a practice and a policy around this critical fundamental principle. And so now we'd like to extend our conversation and invite Ashley Mullins. Thank you, Ashley. Ashley is our Managing Director of Advocacy, and I'm going to hand it over to her.
Thanks, Casey and Kymyona and Sonia and the whole team at Excel and Ed who've made this incredible site possible. I know it took so much work on the back end to get it ready, but it will be so valuable as states seek to understand where they are when it comes to policy and implementation, and then what they can do to strengthen those efforts. Before we dive into the nitty-gritty, we may have some attendees here today who are new to the early literacy policy space. And so I'd love to just give our audience some background on early literacy policy and how we came up with the original 17, now 18 fundamental principles. Kymyona, can we start there?
Yes, thank you, Ashley. It's a great place to start. Again, I apologize for my voice today. In 2002, Florida passed its read by third grade law. And over the last 2 decades, Florida has seen some gains, really some improved outcomes, not just for all students in fourth grade reading, but also for subgroups, right, in fourth grade reading. And so Mississippi's policy, as many others, have adopted those fundamental principles. And so what our comprehensive kind of checklist does is gives us an opportunity to codify those principles in a way where we ensure that we are providing those supports for those key groups, for our educators, our parents and families, and especially for our students.
That's perfect. So let's start here. Early Literacy Matters was already a great site. It had a 50-state scan of policies and was really useful to the folks who accessed it. But where did the concept for the revamp come from, and why is it so necessary now?
This has been such a labor of love. And I think that there are just a lot of tools. There are so many great organizations, many of whom we have partnered with and continue to partner with, that have released tools around policy adoption, right? So which states have adopted which policies. But I think that for us, as I mentioned earlier, there are so many states saying we're adopting all the things on the policymaker side. We're looking at your list and we're adopting all of these things. And why aren't we seeing the student outcomes, right? And so for us, it was just extremely important to take this deep dive into some of the reasons why this work, all of this effort that's being put forth by states isn't translating directly into improved student outcomes. And I think that this tool, it really allows us to bridge this gap between policy and practice. And it also allows us to share best practices. As I mentioned earlier, oh my gosh, those rubrics, those implementation reports are amazing and full of resources and information. So I think that, and I know like in our release, we said, steal the best moves. I think that this is the opportunity for states to be able to kind of look at implementation in other states and be able to steal those moves and not have to recreate the wheel.
When you gave us the overview, I mean, there is just such a wealth of data on this site from all of the states. And so, Casey, I want to bring you in. Can you talk to us about how we got all of the data? Were states involved in helping us to develop this and confirm the information? And you're on mute, Casey.
Would it be a webinar if someone didn't stay on mute?
It wouldn't.
Okay. Yes, thank you for that question, Ashley. I'm excited to get to talk a little bit about the methodology. This was hard work, and we are so proud of it because we are so invested in it, and because it gives such a wonderful tool for so many different people across different stakeholder groups to utilize it and to inform the work that they're doing. In planning for the expansion to the website, we knew that the methodology was going to be really critical. And so we already had a process that was really effective for our 50-state policy scan that we released in 2022. So the first step was to update that with all of the 2023 information. But then we developed the rubric that Kymyona has highlighted and shown you today, and that would guide our implementation analysis. And so once we finalized our rubric, which went through several iterations within our team, but we then presented it to the members of our early literacy network. And those are state leaders from across the nation. And during our summer convening, they poured over that rubric, they combed through it and completed a self-analysis of their own respective states. And then they provided feedback to us and recommendations on how we could improve or tweak the rubric. And so we adjusted in response to their feedback. And then we also engaged a law and policy group, and they assisted us with the implementation research. And then we worked through that research and vetted every rubric many times over. And once those rubrics were finalized for each state, we did then send it back out to state leaders in all 50 states and DC, and we asked for their feedback. And so they had the opportunity to respond in writing, to schedule a Zoom or a phone call, and to respond to the collection of data. And so then we took responses from that, and again, looked at how do we improve it and ensure that we have the most current and accurate information. So it's been through quite a process, and we're excited to share it with the world.
I would expect nothing less from our team, so I'm glad we were able to share that with our listeners today. We already talked a little bit about the findings, but let's dive a little bit deeper. I know one of the first questions we always get as advocates is who is doing the work well? So let's talk on implementation. Who are the exemplars based on what we're seeing in Early Literacy Matters 2.0?
Well, Kymyona already discussed a bit about Florida and Mississippi, and they have the data to demonstrate effectiveness of the comprehensive policies that they've adopted and put into action. I also want to mention North Carolina. They are one of the states that has adopted 18 out of our 18 early literacy fundamental principles. And when we look at their rubric, they have achieved full implementation on 11 of those 18 principles, and they still have 7 that are at partial implementation, but all of those 18 fundamental principles are in action in their state. And so we also recognize them with an above and beyond badge for the science of reading training, because they have rolled that out, and it is a required training for all of their elementary educators, and they extended their training into pre-K all the way through 5th grade. So that certainly is beyond the K-3 focus that we always encourage, but a wonderful way to extend. And then Arkansas is also another great state to take a look at. They, as of their Arkansas Learns Act adoption last year, they now have adoption of 18 out of 18 of our early literacy fundamental principles. They have 5 that are slated for future implementation. So along with our we're constantly watching what other states are doing, but amidst that, we'll be looking to Arkansas to see how they implement those other 5 principles, and then just continue to keep an eye on the nation and who's doing it well, so that we can highlight that work and learn from it.
Thank you, Ashley, for those questions. I want to flip the script on you. A lot of people may know that Excel in Ed has a partner, a sister organization, Excel in Ed in Action, as managing director for our advocacy team. You and advocacy team members, you work with policymakers and other leaders all across the country as they consider education policies like these, right, to implement in their state. So how do you feel your team can best use this resource with policymakers?
I'm just so excited. But so let me start with this. State leaders and policymakers think about and develop positions on hundreds of policy issues each and every day. And while I wish they had all the time in the world to spend on education policy, the reality is they just don't. So to make a resource useful for those policymakers and make it actionable, it has to be straightforward. And so I feel like Early Literacy Matters serves as that centralized hub for policymakers. It gives them access to a vast array of data and information all in one place. And because it aggregates all that information, it gives them a comprehensive understanding of where their states are currently. And it's very, very clear where they need to go to improve their state policy.
And you often say that we are, excuse me, a think tank and a do tank. And I love that phrase. We talk about it all the time. So as you think about ways to use this across states, what are your favorite features?
So those who work with us at the state level across the country know that we do influence policy at the state level. And so I feel like the best part for an advocate has to be the state specific pages, right? Policymakers, they do want to understand what's going on around them, that's for sure. but they want to know what policies they have on the books and what their roadmap is to improve. And so sometimes states tackle literacy policy in a comprehensive manner, and we certainly advocate for that. We would love for you to put all of the fundamental principles into action. But other times progress is incremental. And so state policy makers might need to tackle a few things and then come back for a few more in future sessions. And so having an up-to-date state checklist, so to speak, I think that will be updated once certain policies do pass. It's going to give our leaders a playbook to follow. And then beyond that, we also know that states are sometimes competitive, right? They like to be on the cutting edge. And I particularly love the In Your Neighborhood section that appears at the bottom of each state page. So everybody should be sure to check that out. It just gives you a look at the states around your state. And so if you want to, play to that competitive nature of state policymakers, that's a great feature. And the site really does serve as a repository for the proven policy solutions adopted and implemented. So policymakers can learn from other successful states and then emulate them, as you said earlier, not recreate the wheel. And then, of course, you mentioned it earlier, but the mobile site optimization is awesome, right? So we can easily access information while we're in a meeting in a state capital. I think that's really great.
One thing that our early literacy team does a lot is that we think about how we can contribute to the field, right? We have created a lot of model policies. We do have our resource, the how-to implementation guide, and other resources. So how can we at ExcelinEd continue to make this a valuable resource for policymakers and even advocacy organizations, other advocacy organizations and coalitions, right? That you and your team help to bring together and provide information for?
That's a great question. I think one of the most important things we can do as advocates is to be timely, up to date, and accurate, right, with the information that we're giving our policymakers. Because then the hope is that they take that information and then utilize it. So we want to make sure we're giving them the best of the best. And so I feel like moving forward, ensuring that the website provides for regular updates based on policy developments, right? Every year we're seeing so many states tackle early literacy policy. So this is going to continue to change. And we're going to continue to see more states move into that green category, hopefully. So those regular updates based on policy developments, legislative changes, and those emerging trends across the country, that will allow our policymakers to stay informed about those evolving issues and adjust their strategies accordingly. For example, when Early Literacy Matters was first released, we at ExcelinEd hadn't really yet focused intently on including explicit 3Qing bans in legislative language. But now, we're going to see that in Early Literacy Matters 2.0 because it's an important fundamental principle. And so legislators can continue to update and improve their laws based on what we have in this resource.
Well, thank you so much for providing insight as to how we can bridge policy and practice together. I may have a couple more questions for you, but now I want to bring Sonia Yates on, our Associate Policy Director, who has kind of been monitoring the Q&A. And Sonia, are there some questions for us from attendees?
Yes, there are. Thank you so much. You guys, that was a great job. And this has been a work of love. There's a question about, as states implement new practices, how should we go about making ExcelinEd aware of these changes?
That is a great question. Casey, you may want to add something as well. I do want to take this opportunity to really kind of plug our early literacy network. We currently have a network of state literacy leaders. We meet quarterly throughout the year to discuss implementation, to also provide supports to states and connect them with other states. So it's kind of our own professional learning community. So we now have 34 states plus DC that's included in our early literacy network. And they do have direct access, right, to us, to our early literacy team, to be able to provide those updates to us. But then also for others, Ashley mentioned that we will update this website with the different implementation evidence annually. But as you think about submitting that type of information to us, then our emails are available at the end of this presentation. And you can contact us, either me, Casey, or Sonia, any member of our team. And we will be sure to, at our annual review time, we will be sure to update all of the rubrics, of course, in the website with that new information. Casey, did I miss something?
I would just add that we, for something to be scored or noted on the rubrics, it in most of the categories, it does have to already exist in policy. So if it is a proposed policy, or it's being slated for a vote this year or to try to advance, we wouldn't yet be able to register it on our rubrics. It does have to exist in policy. I think there's really only just a couple of there's a couple of principles where guidance at the state level is sufficient for that principle, but the majority of them do require policy adoption.
Great point.
Great, thank y'all. And one more, actually a couple more. Do you have any info on district level implementation?
We did not collect district level implementation, but states can use this. I think one of the key components of implementation is monitoring. You know, we talk about progress monitoring for our students in classes, right? But as we are thinking, especially from a state level, and even some of these policies that are adopted at a district level, you have to monitor the implementation process. So I think that states can begin here with their implementation analysis report to work with districts to ensure that they are implementing the fundamental principles as intended and to the degree that it should be implemented. And then also finding places where there are gaps, you know, maybe limited resources, not enough guidance, right, as to how to do it right. So I think that this can be very, very useful for states to then support districts as they are implementing these policies.
And I'd also jump in and add, you know, as we see legislation moving across states, we love to see a reporting mechanism in that language, right? So that state departments of education are requiring the reporting on curriculum adoption from their local districts. And so while we certainly, I mean, this was a labor of love to get the state level data. To get district level data from across the country would be quite a task, but we certainly encourage state policy to require some of that reporting and transparency at the state level.
Great, thank you. Ashley, I think this one would be geared towards you. It's in the chat. Will excel in action engage in states that are attempting to roll back strong early education reforms? And they're asking because Arizona legislators are debating bills to roll back regulations and policies.
They sure are, Catherine. The answer to that question is an emphatic yes. You know, just because a policy has passed doesn't mean our job as advocates are done. We see time and time again when the political winds shift or pressures from groups starts to rise, we do see efforts to try to roll back really critical pieces of early literacy policy. So we are definitely hot on the trails on the Arizona bills. We're calling them the backtrack trio, right? Because there's a number of things that they want to roll back this year, even outside of early literacy, that we're hoping to hold strong against. But that early literacy endorsement for those teachers, yes, we certainly are engaged in the fight to roll that, or to stop that from being rolled back. And then other states, right? Last year, Tennessee had a pretty big battle over giving students more time to master those fundamental reading skills by the end of third grade. And we played an integral role in that as well. So yes, Catherine, thank you for that question. We will continue to stand with our state partners to fight against any rollbacks to this policy.
Great, thank you. One more, and I think Kymyona and Casey, this is going to be a very familiar question to you because we get this all the time. How do states with local control overcome the challenges of implementation?
Casey, I'll let you start first on this one.
Well, I think that one of the things that is so critical around overcoming the challenges is having good thought partners, strategic planning. And when you can, as Kymyona says, steal the best moves or learn from what other people have tried and either succeeded at or encountered barriers, that's a great way. So our Early Literacy Network brings together state leaders from state agencies, and they have the opportunity to interact at least quarterly as well as other times throughout the year. And so we hear from them that that's really some of their best professional development, because they get to interact with job-alike peers who are encountering and dealing with the same things. And so I think that that's a critical way. Also, looking at what the research has shown around different practices that are a part of those fundamental principles, and what are best practices around early literacy advancement. We know science of reading training advances classroom performance because the instruction improves, and then we see students start making gains at higher rates. And so we can look to the research in a lot of cases as well. I think there's so many ways that we can work and overcome challenges. And I would really love to see states continue and expand their efforts to evaluate their programs so that we do have even more actionable data that can inform decision-making, both among the states who are doing the studies on their self-work, but then also be able to help other states learn from what they've done and what has shown to be most effective.
I recently had an amazing opportunity. I was invited to speak to the National School Boards Association. And that is a group that I think has not had a lot of engagement at no one's fault, right? But this is a very, very important group, right? They make those local decisions for their school boards. They approve which curricula to adopt, right? They approve assessments. So they approve all of these things. And I think that sometimes there just has to be some stakeholder awareness, like within communities and within local boards. These are the best practices. So I would urge states that when they have their kind of state school boards association meetings to highlight literacy efforts for school board members, to really kind of educate them on the policies that the state has adopted, but then also the ways in which they expect these fundamental principles to be implemented, so that those school board members can really kind of go in with more knowledge and more of an understanding as to what it's going to take to improve student outcomes. And even for their group, the one thing I say is that your agenda reflects your priorities. Right? So ensuring that at school board meetings that they are sharing data from their school district, right? So everyone understands that we still need to meet the needs of so many other students. Even if you have A schools, there are still some students who aren't performing well. We want to address the needs of all kids. So I will add that on your to-do list to definitely begin to engage with your school boards more, especially as we are looking at this local control kind of challenge in some of the states.
Great, thank you. Last question. What are some of the common challenges that we see with implementation?
So would this be across the country?
Yes.
I think the common challenges across the country, I'll say number one, and Ashley may want to chime in as well, funding, right? There's nothing worse than an unfunded mandate. And so, especially with a lot of our federal funds that are coming to an end, some school districts and states are wondering how to continue some of these things that they may have started, especially during and post-COVID. So I think that funding becomes a challenge in some cases. And then also state agency capacity. When you adopt a law like this, please make sure that the state agency who's going to be responsible for overseeing the implementation of it has the capacity, the infrastructure to be able to implement the law. And those just are kind of my top two. I'll push it to you, Ashley, and then to Casey.
I was gonna echo that. Funding. It's the number one question we get from lawmakers, right? How are we gonna fund this? so that it's not an unfunded mandate. You know, we understand that there are costs associated with helping school districts shift from curriculum that they're currently using that might have those outdated, disproven methods a part of them, moving to high quality instructional materials. It might cost money to get a high quality screener in there, right? And we do see some states take on that cost too. And there have been some states that have provided kind of the carrot approach to funding to the local school districts to help them make that shift in curriculum and adopt those screeners. And so that's certainly one of the key questions we get as we're looking at this policy. And then I think, you know, we already brought it up, the local control debate. And I want to be clear, right? No state in the nation has said in their policy, every school district in our state is adopting one curriculum, right? Like there's still inherent flexibility built into these policies, but guardrails, right? Because we know what works for kids and we know what doesn't work. And we want to make sure that the money that is being spent in a state is being spent on, you know, policies and instructional methods and materials that are proven to work for kids.
I'll add just two other things. I think that Ashley and Kymyona have done a great job of summarizing a lot of the things that we hear frequently. Another thing is communication. And I'm going to steal Kymyona's line. She always says people need to see themselves in these laws. They need to see their role and their part. So I'll use that line because it's so true. You have to be able to communicate with all of the stakeholders, and that doesn't always look the same. And so the ability to communicate with stakeholders at all levels is going to be really critical. And then transparency with each of those stakeholder groups too, so that everyone is able to not just see themselves in the law, but also understand what they can contribute and what does it mean for them in the role that they're in. And then I'd also like to just mention literacy coaches. Building a model that is developed for hiring, for deployment, for training, for rollout, all of that is so critical. And some states experience challenges in trying to build a model that can be rolled out with fidelity and create consistency in how they move forward. And so I'll make a little plug. One of the things that we have in progress at this moment, and we are in development with a partner on, is going to be a literacy coach training module series that will be, you can look for the first part of it in the summer, this coming summer, and then we'll be rolling out more next fall. So keep that in mind for future opportunities that we'll be sharing with you.
Great, thank you. One last question that was put into the chat. Have you done any research on the best curriculum used for implementation?
Well, I think that we have, we've been able to review a lot of lists that a lot of states have released. Many states have also released their rubrics. The one thing that we've seen is that all rubrics are not created equally. So whereas the rubric will give the descriptors for what constitutes a high quality curriculum in some of those states, some of those curricula may still include practices aligned with 3Qing or balanced literacy or whole language with some science of reading sprinkled in, right? So I think that for states that are utilizing rubrics to identify curricula, that they need to consider all of those things in the rubrics that they choose. But I do want to say that we've spoken kind of at length about the importance of science of reading training and building teacher knowledge to empower teachers to be able to teach children, right, on day one. But we haven't talked as much about building teachers' knowledge on how to teach from the curriculum that's adopted, right? The ways in which they should utilize the instructional resources, the supplemental resources, you know, of course, with the core reading instruction, what that looks like as effective tier 1 instruction. So for states that are adopting lists or requiring the adoption of high quality instructional materials, make sure that you are including, even in districts that is left up to districts to adopt, make sure that you are including this runway for teachers to receive professional development as to how to utilize the curriculum. separate from building their knowledge of science of reading, how do I utilize this core curriculum? That is going to be extremely important in what your expectations are going to be with how well this curriculum is being implemented in your schools. So I did want to mention that we can't just put a curriculum on the list and say, yay, we've adopted the right one. There has to be these safety nets and supports for teachers built in so that they'll know how to plan for and utilize the curriculum. And if there aren't any other responses or reactions from Casey or Ashley, we want to thank you so much for joining us today for the release of Early Literacy Matters 2.0. This webinar recording will be released shortly. And any questions that you may have, again, you may contact one of us on the team. Go to excellined.org and to our Early Literacy Matters page and in our staff page, and you can find our contact information. But we really appreciate you for joining us today, and we hope that you enjoy this tool and that you utilize it and that you find it as a very, very helpful resource as you all are doing this work to improve student outcomes for all children across our country. So thank you again for joining us.